What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an early preview of New Arc Line, an upcoming steampunk crpg that shares a lot in common with games like Arcanum, and we'll get into all that, but first I'm able to bring you this preview courtesy of the game's publisher, Fulcrum Publishing, reaching out and offering up a look at an early version of what I believe is going to be a demo for Steam Next Fest coming up in October. So theoretically, I believe you'll be able to play this for yourself here in a couple weeks, but what can you expect from the game at that particular point? Well, I will say that from my experience, which encompassed the introduction to the game, a couple hours worth of gameplay, and most of the systems, but not all, this definitely seems like a game that's trying to punch above its weight in terms of what it offers. But it's important to mention that what you see here is not everything. For instance, there's only 2 races in the character creator, but we know there's going to be at least 2 more, dwarves and giants to be specific, alongside a host of other classes to go along with that. But let's go ahead and dive into it. So the story of New Arc Line centers around the city of New Arc and the problems it's dealing with. Once upon a time, magic ruled the world before technology and humans started to take over, and there's been a balance of power between the two ever since, with these days technology largely winning. In fact, people don't seem to be particularly fond of anything to do with magic these days, and things like the suspicious Iron Plague going around causing all manner of grief certainly aren't helping on that front. But we find ourselves arriving in the city of New Arc to deliver a package of some sort. It seems to be something suspicious, we're not really told what it is, but that is our reason for coming to this new land. But first, you of course have to make your character. Now, as I mentioned, this is a little limited at the moment, but there is more stuff planned. You can pick between 2 races here, elf and human, as well as determining some of their basic stats and whatnot. There is an appearance portion of this, which seems decently in-depth for an isometric indie title, though I will say the game does seem a little light on portraits in particular. But then the really important stuff. So first we're going to pick between our classes, and in this demo it's just Diesel Engineer as well as Voodoo Shaman. From what I could tell playing the game, there seems to be 3 different types of tech: Diesel, Steam, and Tesla, whereas there are also 3 types of magic: Voodoo, Celestial, and the Occult. After that, you're going to pick up the trait you happen to want. These are your standard sort of positive for a negative that manages to define your character and let you hone in on something you want to specialize in, which is then further enhanced by stat points as well as skill points. Stat points are for your primary attributes. From what I can tell, you don't really seem to have a whole lot of control over these after the game starts, so it does seem like what you choose here at character creation is pretty important in determining what your character is going to be qualified to do, so to speak, as these attributes affect things both in combat, but also your various skill checks you'll be performing, which is where your skill points come in. There's a whole host of different skills to choose from, and they do seem to come up a fair bit, as just the few things we see in the prologue here do offer a variety of different ways to go about individual quests and problems. Now, the very early portion of the game sees an airship crashing, seemingly attacked by a dragon of some description, and given how Arcanum also starts with an airship crashing, I have to assume that's probably intentional. But what follows is a very quick controls tutorial that gets you up to speed with the basics of how the games work, things like skill checks, etc., before you find yourself in the city of New Arc looking to deliver this package, which puts you into contact with your first companion, as well as trying to pass a few different objectives just to get through the front gate, so to speak, as what you're carrying seems to be somewhat illicit in nature. But in service of that, we're going to come across a whole different bunch of equipment to get ourselves kitted out before we engage in a few combat encounters, as well as opportunities to, of course, look around, but also engage in various skill checks and find out how things work. So, when it comes to the skill check side of things, these are pretty much what you'd imagine. There's more passive roles like observation when you enter an area, which can point you directly to quest objectives at times instead of having to actually look for them. And then more direct stuff that you see in, say, conversation, where you're actively trying to do something like intimidate or persuade someone. Now, what I thought was especially interesting about that is that those skill checks take into account the mood of the person you're talking to. So sometimes you would get a bonus or penalty to, say, talking someone into something you want based on the mood that person is in. For instance, if a person was angry, it was actually more difficult to intimidate them. But another interesting thing about this system is that sometimes if you, say, just miss a roll, you can use some accumulated tarot cards, for lack of a better word, to re-roll that to a number you have a better shot of winning, though it seems guaranteed if the tarot card is good enough. And I'd be curious to see how they're going to wind up balancing that in the future, especially versus just saves coming through it anyway. But there are also a handful of other systems I wanted to mention, like for instance the magic crafting or tech crafting. So magic crafting seems to be accomplished by sort of creating your own spells in some manner. As you explore, you can find scrolls that can teach you elements of this spell crafting, which is divided into form, element, and modifier. And you can combine those to create spells and the like that you could theoretically then use in combat. And I didn't see anything that specifically was non-combat related, so the jury's still out on that one. But there also seems to be tech crafting as well, which is a little more traditional crafting system where you find materials and then turn that into things like grenades. But all of those systems, the skill checks, the crafting, etc., gets you interacting with the world, which so far seems appropriately steampunk. Characters with all sorts of modifications, over-the-top personalities, gears and electricity everywhere. Promises of a greater future, built naturally upon the backs of the downtrodden, counter to everything the city is claiming to be. So, while I only experienced a portion of it, the aesthetic especially seems to be on point, and I'll be very curious to see if they can manage to turn the city of New Ark into a place that really feels alive and like its own character in the story as well, since it's so central to everything going on. But from there, let's talk a little bit about combat. So, early days here to be sure, especially since we don't have access to all of the races and classes, but for the most part this seems to be a 2 action system and a movement system, very standard for turn-based games. Every turn you'll have movement and actions that you can take, and the actions you can take seem to mostly be derived from what your character knows versus what their weapon is giving them access to as well. So for instance, I played a voodoo shaman here, and he picked up a staff basically that allowed him to shoot a voodoo magic bolt at people, but he also knew a couple spells just in general that he could cast whether or not he had that equipped or not. Now another interesting thing I really wanted to mention here was that everyone seems to have an armor rating that regenerates every turn. Basically, in order to damage someone's health, you first have to get through their armor, which acts as a sort of temporary health bar that is up every single turn. And while honestly there simply wasn't enough game here to say one way or another in terms of how I think that system will pan out, but I do think that's the kind of thing that might be a little tricky to balance, but only really time is going to tell on that particular front. Overall, with this relatively short preview of the game, I will say I was pleasantly surprised. I think this is already shaping up to be a pretty solid game, if, of course, they can actually follow through with it on everything else the title has to offer. But first impressions-wise, I think it's in a pretty solid spot, and I hope they wind up releasing more news about this game relatively soon, in terms of things like a release date, what to expect, etc. Because, as always, I'm pumped for any new CRPGs, but having played a couple hours of this one, I'm especially curious to know if they can manage to pull this one across the finish line, as it certainly has a lot of potential. But that is as good a place as any to wrap up this particular video, which I certainly hope you enjoyed, found it informative, though I'd love to know what you think about this particular title thus far, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.